If you cannot escape lust, the question is not what you want. The question is what you are trying not to feel. Most people come to this problem the wrong way. They treat it as a question of appetite. They say, "My desire is too strong, my willpower is too weak, and if I were a better person, I would simply stop." That explanation feels honest. It feels appropriately self-critical, and it is almost entirely wrong. Not because desire is irrelevant, but because when a person genuinely cannot escape a recurring urge, when it returns again and again against their own interests, despite promises and private speeches and genuine attempts to stop, something more is happening than appetite, something the word desire does not fully capture. I want to show you what that something is, because once you see the real mechanism, the struggle begins to make a different kind of sense. Not comfortable sense, not the sense that lets you off the hook, but the deeper, more unsettling sense that comes when you finally understand what the mind has actually been doing. And I suspect you will recognize it. Let us begin with the most common explanation people give themselves. I cannot stop because I have a high sex drive. This sounds biological, scientific even. And it is true that human beings vary in the intensity of their desire. That variation is real. But here is what this explanation cannot account for. Why does the urge appear most powerfully, not when a person is satisfied and full of life, but when they are stressed, exhausted, rejected, bored, or empty? If this was simply about drive, about an overflowing biological appetite, then the urge should be fairly consistent, strong when you are healthy, present when you are rested. It should not spike reliably after a humiliating workday. It should not intensify precisely when you feel most alone. It should not arrive most urgently at 11 o'clock at night, when the rest of the house is quiet and the weight of some unspoken disappointment settles over you like weather. But for many people, that is exactly when it arrives. That is not drive. That is a signal. And the signal is not saying what most people think it is saying. Here is the first real mechanism. The mind learns very early and very efficiently what reduces discomfort quickly. This is not a flaw. This is the mind doing its job. When something relieves pain, any kind of pain, the mind registers that relief. It stores it. It begins to associate certain cues, certain moods, certain moments of the day with the behavior that made the discomfort disappear. Over time, the behavior does not need to be chosen. It begins to suggest itself. The cue appears, the stress, the loneliness, the boredom, the rejection, and the mind offers its fastest available solution. Not the wisest solution, the fastest one. This is why a man can be genuinely intelligent, genuinely motivated to change, and still find himself returning to the same behavior again and again. It is not because his character is weak. It is because the behavior has been wired into a loop. The loop runs faster than his intentions can respond. And here is the part that most explanations miss entirely. Lust, in many lives, has been recruited into this loop not as pleasure, but as relief. Not as an expression of vitality, but as an exit from distress. I would say it plainly. Lust becomes dangerous not when desire is too strong, but when it learns how to soothe you. That is a different problem, and it requires a different understanding. Think about the man who comes home after a day that went badly. He was dismissed in a meeting, a project fell apart, or nothing dramatic happened at all. He simply spent 8 hours managing the invisible weight of responsibilities that feel increasingly detached from anything he actually values. He is tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. He is the other kind, the kind that sits behind the eyes. He does not sit down and think, "I will now use sexual stimulation to regulate my emotional state." He does not think anything like that. He simply feels a pull, an urge. And the urge is compelling because somewhere in his history, learned early, reinforced often, That particular form of relief was discovered to work. For a few minutes the weight lifts, the noise quiets, the tightness releases, and then it returns, usually with a passenger it did not bring on the way in, a dim, familiar shame. That shame is where the story gets more complicated. Most people believe shame is the cure for this problem. If you feel bad enough about what you have done, you will eventually stop doing it. Shame, on this view, is corrective. It is the internal punishment that teaches better behavior. But observe what actually happens in practice. The person acts, the shame arrives. They make a private promise, never again. They may believe this promise completely, they mean it. And then, hours later or days later or sometimes only minutes later, the very discomfort of the shame itself becomes a cue. And the fastest available relief for that discomfort is the same behavior that produced the shame in the first place. The shame does not end the loop. In many cases, the shame becomes part of the loop. This is not a moral failure. This is a mechanism. The mind is doing what the mind does, seeking relief from discomfort through the fastest available means. When shame becomes the new discomfort, the mind reaches for the same exit it has always used. I would say this: shame is a poor architect of change. It can produce regret. It can produce self-contempt. What it rarely produces, on its own, is a different life. And yet people keep trying. They keep hoping that if the shame were sharp enough, persistent enough, loud enough, it would finally be sufficient. They are waiting for the pain of their behavior to outweigh the relief it provides. But they are not accounting for the fact that the shame itself is being added to the emotional weight that makes the relief necessary in the first place. This is the shame cycle. And it is one of the most common invisible traps in human psychology. But let us go deeper, because the shame cycle is only the surface of a more troubling pattern. What is the lust actually concealing? I do not mean this as a poetic question, I mean it as a clinical one. When a behavior is repeated despite consequences, despite promises, despite genuine desire to stop, the behavior is almost never the whole story. It is a solution to a problem the person has not fully named. So what is the problem? In my experience observing the interior life of human beings, the answer varies. But certain themes appear again and again with such consistency that they deserve to be named directly. The first is loneliness. Not always the obvious loneliness of isolation. Often a more subtle, more painful variety. The loneliness of being physically surrounded by other people, perhaps even a spouse, a family, colleagues, while feeling essentially unseen, unloved in the specific way one needs to be loved, present in the room but absent from the conversation that matters. When this is the case, lust does not arrive as appetite. It arrives as substitute, as a form of contact that does not require vulnerability, as a simulation of closeness that carries none of the risk. And here is what I find most revealing about human nature in this pattern. The relief is real. I am not saying the person is deluded. The comfort that lust provides in those moments is genuine, brief but genuine. The problem is that it is comfort for a wound that it cannot actually treat. The loneliness that drove the person to seek the relief returns after the relief passes, slightly deeper than before. This is what I mean when I say that some people are not addicted to lust. They are addicted to the temporary disappearance of loneliness. Why does this matter? Because if the underlying problem is loneliness, then every attempt to address lust through discipline alone, through willpower, through shame, through private promises, is addressing the wrong level of the problem entirely. You cannot argue a man out of needing warmth. You cannot shame him into not needing to feel seen. If those needs remain unaddressed, and lust has learned to approximate their satisfaction, then removing lust without replacing it with something that actually nourishes those needs is not recovery. It is merely substitution or suppression. And suppression, as I have observed, has a particular quality. What you push underground does not disappear. It waits, and when it returns, it often returns wearing a stronger face. Now, let me address a belief that I hear expressed with tremendous conviction. If I were stronger, I would simply stop. This is perhaps the most seductive and most misleading story that people tell themselves about this problem. It is seductive because it locates the failure in a familiar place, in character, in willpower, in moral discipline. This is a story men especially find easier to tell themselves than the alternative, because the alternative is more threatening. The alternative suggests that the problem is not merely about strength, but about something more vulnerable, about what they are trying to escape, what they have not been able to face, what unmet need they have been quietly carrying for years without a language for it. The willpower story keeps the problem at the surface. It says, "The issue is that I act on the impulse. Fix the impulse control, fix the problem." But self-control research and simple, careful observation of human behavior both point toward the same conclusion. Willpower is not a reservoir that simply needs to be enlarged. It is a capacity that depends enormously on context, on structure, on the habits of the environment surrounding the person. A man who controls his food, his work schedule, his finances with great discipline, but who cannot control this particular domain, that man is not generally weak. He is specifically poorly structured in this domain. His evenings are unguarded. His cues remain active, his environment has been left unchanged, and every night his good intentions face down the same triggers in the same conditions and produce the same outcome. You cannot out-lecture a habit that is built into your evenings. The man who genuinely wants change does not need more shame and stronger intentions. He needs a different architecture for his life. The battle is not only internal, it is also structural. But there is still a deeper layer, and I want to take you there carefully, because this is where the psychology becomes genuinely unsettling. Some people, when they examine this pattern honestly, not the public version but the private version they have never quite spoken aloud, begin to notice something strange. The urge is not always attached to general stress. It is attached to specific kinds of stress, specific kinds of pain. Rejection, especially, tends to produce a very particular spike in the urge. Humiliation, status injury. A moment when a person feels they do not matter, are not respected, are not enough. And in those moments, lust arrives not merely as distraction, but as something that feels briefly like restoration. Think about this carefully. When a man is rejected, professionally, socially, romantically, and he turns to sexual fantasy or stimulation in the aftermath, what is the mind seeking? Not merely pleasure. The pleasure is almost incidental. What the mind is seeking is a sense of being desired, of potency, of not being the person who was dismissed, overlooked, deemed insufficient. In those moments, lust is being used as ego repair, as a private correction to a wound the person has not been able to address directly, as a way of feeling powerful when powerlessness has just arrived. And this, I would say, is where the mechanism becomes most complex, because it means that the urge is not simply attached to pleasure-seeking, it is attached to self-image, to identity, to the private project of proving something to oneself. The body asks for pleasure, the wounded ego asks for proof. Consider the older man, the man who has moved past youth, past the years when certain doors were obviously open, when potential felt unlimited. He may have achieved a great deal, or he may feel he achieved less than he once believed was possible. In either case, there is a particular vulnerability that arrives with age that younger people often underestimate. The fear of irrelevance, the fear of decline, the suspicion, arriving quietly on certain evenings, that one is slowly becoming invisible to the world that once paid attention. For such a man, lust can take on a meaning entirely disproportionate to its surface content. It becomes, privately, proof that he is still alive in some essential way, still potent, still present in his own body. The impulse is not merely sexual, it is existential. And this is why moral arguments and shame-based approaches are so completely ineffective with this particular version of the problem. You are not speaking to the appetite, you are speaking past the deeper conversation the man is having with himself about who he is, how much time he has left, and whether he has spent it well. Some men arrive very late in life without having resolved this. They look back across decades of private struggle, decades of promises and relapses and shame and temporary victories that gave way to new defeats, and they wonder why the years of fighting never produced a lasting change. The answer, in most cases, is that they were fighting the symptom. The wound beneath it remained, unnamed and unaddressed, for the length of their lives. This is not a comfortable thing to witness, but it is one of the most important things I can offer you. There is another layer that I have not yet addressed, and it is one that many people find surprisingly relevant to their own experience. Sometimes the distress a person feels about this pattern is not entirely, or even mainly, produced by the behavior itself. It is produced by the gap between what they did and who they believe themselves to be. A man with strong moral or religious commitments experiences his lust through the lens of those commitments. When he acts against them, he does not only feel the ordinary discomfort of regret, he feels something more total, a sense that he has betrayed his own identity, that there is a version of him that acts this way, and a version of him that believes certain things about himself and the world, and those two versions cannot be reconciled. This is a genuine form of suffering, and I want to be careful to say that it is not imaginary or exaggerated. The conflict between act and self-image can be one of the most psychologically painful experiences available to a human being. But, and this is the nuance that most moral framings miss entirely, this kind of distress is not the same as compulsive behavior. A person can feel extreme shame and self-condemnation after an experience of lust, without that lust being clinically disordered. The distress can exceed the actual loss of control. What this means practically is that two people can describe their experience of being trapped by lust in almost identical terms and be experiencing very different things. One is struggling with genuine repetitive loss of control that is damaging his life. The other is struggling primarily with the fact that his normal human desire conflicts violently with his values. These require different understanding. I am not saying the second form of suffering is less real. I am saying it may be less about compulsion and more about the war between impulse and ideal. And those who are losing that war primarily at the level of identity rather than behavior need not be treated as though they are enslaved. They need first to be given permission to understand the difference between natural desire and disorder, and then, from that clearer ground, to make choices that are genuinely their own. Now, I want to return to something I mentioned earlier, because I think it is the most important structural observation in this entire discussion. The mind reinforces what works quickly. This is not a moral claim. It is a description of how learning operates in human beings. And it has a consequence that most people engaged in this struggle have never fully absorbed. The longer a pattern runs, the more deeply it is embedded, not only in behavior, but in the neural architecture of response. The cue triggers the behavior faster. The association between certain emotional states and the relief becomes more automatic. The habit begins, in a very real sense, to choose itself. This is why time alone does not fix this. People sometimes believe that if they simply wait long enough, if they age past it, or if circumstances change, or if they accumulate enough failed attempts, the problem will eventually fade. In some cases, for some people, external life changes produce internal changes. But in many cases, the opposite is true. Repetition strengthens the pathway. What has been practiced for years is not weakened by the passage of time, it is deepened by it. And this is where I would suggest the real nature of the challenge becomes clear. The question is not only how to resist the urge in the moment, The question is how to live differently enough that the urge arises in a different context, with a different emotional charge, and begins to lose its function. Because lust that serves no psychological function is simply desire, and desire on its own is manageable. It is lust as coping, lust as escape, lust as ego repair, lust as loneliness soothing that becomes ungovernable. Not because the desire itself is too strong, but because the need beneath it has never been met in any other way. Let me offer you an image. Imagine a man who, for as long as he can remember, has used a particular exit door whenever a building catches fire. Every time, without thinking. He knows the exit, he trusts the exit. When the alarm goes off, his feet move toward it before his mind fully registers the sound. Now imagine that the alarm begins going off not only during actual fires, but whenever the building gets too warm, whenever he feels uncomfortable, whenever something in the atmosphere creates even the suggestion of heat. And each time he takes the exit, the door swings a little more easily. The path to it becomes more worn. He finds himself outside before he remembers choosing to leave. That is the structure of a habit loop built on emotional coping. The exit is real. The relief it provides is real. But a man who can only leave a building when it becomes uncomfortable has not mastered his environment. His environment has mastered him. The opposite of this is not purity. It is not the absence of desire. The opposite is integration. A person who has learned enough other ways of managing discomfort, repairing his sense of himself after injury, tolerating loneliness without immediately reaching for a substitute, and sitting with emptiness long enough to discover what it is actually asking for. That is a different kind of interior life, not a perfect one, not an ascetic one, but one in which desire has been returned to its appropriate place, which is that of appetite, not governor. I want to say something directly now about the men who carry this privately for years. The secrecy changes something. This is not a metaphor. When a person holds a significant part of their interior life in a separate compartment, available to themselves but shown to no one, a particular erosion begins to occur. Not in the obvious way that moralists describe, not simply in the corruption of character, but in the quality of self-knowledge. A man who has divided himself into a public self and a private self for long enough begins to lose the thread between them. He becomes practiced at presentation. He learns to inhabit the version of himself that others see, and less practiced at inhabiting the version that actually exists. And over time, this division creates a kind of interior distance from himself. He knows what he does privately, but he becomes less and less sure of who he actually is. Secrecy changes a man, even when no one else sees it. This is not a reason for public confession. Confession for its own sake solves nothing at the level of mechanism, but it is a reason to take seriously the cost of the division. The hidden life does not remain safely hidden. It seeps into the visible one. It affects the depth of connection a man can make with others, because genuine connection requires a self that is not being permanently withheld. It affects his relationship with his own experience, because a man who cannot honestly witness himself cannot accurately change himself. So I want to end with the question that I believe sits underneath everything I have described. Not, how do I stop? That is the question most people begin with, and it is not a wrong question. But it is the second question. The first question, the one that precedes all others and makes all others answerable, is this. What has this urge been doing for me? Not in the sense of pleasure, not in the limited sense of biology, but functionally, psychologically. What has it been managing? What has it been protecting you from feeling? What emptiness has it been filling? What wound has it been numbing? What version of yourself has it been temporarily repairing? Because when a person can answer that question honestly, not in the abstract, but with specific, uncomfortable accuracy about their own interior life, the problem begins to change shape. It becomes less about a drive that is too powerful and more about a need that has never been met in an honest way. It becomes less about weakness and more about an emotional education that somewhere along the way got stuck using a very old, very fast, and ultimately very expensive solution. Many people do not conquer this struggle because they never discover the sadness beneath it. They never ask what loneliness is using lust as a mask for. They never sit still long enough to let the discomfort name itself, rather than immediately offering it a way out. I am not suggesting this is easy. I am suggesting it is the correct direction. The man who asks only how to stop will often find himself asking the same question again, in 5 years, in 10 years, with a different life and the same private war. The man who asks why he returns, and who is willing to receive an honest answer, is standing at the beginning of a genuinely different story. Desire is not the enemy, but desire that governs your life has ceased to be innocent. And the path out of that governance is not through stronger suppression, it is through deeper understanding. What has your lust been protecting you from? That is the question I would leave with you. Not as an accusation, as a beginning.